we are happy to have our panelists over here, Dolkun Isak, who is the president of the World Uyghur Congress, Maya Wang, who's a senior researcher on China with Human Rights Watch, Raffaello Pantucci, who's an old friend of ORF's and a senior associate fellow at RUSI, who's now currently working out of Singapore, and our moderator, Jacinta Carroll, who is a senior research fellow at the National Security College at the Australian National University. We're hoping to be joined in the course of this conversation by India's former ambassador to Beijing, Mr. Gautam Bambawale. He's having some technical issues joining the platform, but we will start without him, and hopefully he'll join the conversation. So with that, Jacinta, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Maya, and namaste, everybody. We have three eminent experts as our panelists to guide us through a very complex and very timely topic today. The way this session will work is that each of our panelists will provide some brief introductory remarks before we move on to a panel discussion and Q&A. So for those who are online watching, please send your questions through. There will be a section at the bottom of your screen window where you can write your questions through, and our great behind-the-scenes team at ORF will be curating those questions to make sure they get through to us. So in the field of terrorism, we primarily focus on non-state actors, violent ideological movements that occur mostly in the margins of normal state-on-state relations. Indeed, in my experience, countering terrorism is one area where most countries, even those with long-standing disputes, can actually collaborate and find some common ground. An ongoing rub point, however, is when authoritarian states choose to label actions by their citizens as terrorists. This becomes more problematic the more powerful a state is. The issue of Uyghurs in China is one of those matters in this grey zone of dispute. But like other controversies affecting China, this appeared to be being dealt with by that country as separate from their more positive economic and trade impact on the world. However, this year's COVID-19 pandemic appears to have crashed through and upset this delicate balance of separation between the Chinese government's economic, political and social activities. And as questions are being asked about the Chinese government's transparency and accountability, the global community is also looking at the People's Republic of China, looking at them closely. There are a number of pressure points appearing in China's engagement with the world: concerns about China's technology and privacy, confrontation on the border with India and in the South China Sea, misinformation, denial and accusation. These things aren't unusual to human rights, terrorism and democracy experts, however. These tactics aren't new. So to help guide us through this very complex environment that seems to be touching upon everything happening in the world, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome our experts. And first up, I'd like to welcome Dolkun, as Maya introduced, President of the World Uyghur Congress. We have an activist, then we'll have an investigative researcher and an academic. So I think all in all, we're going to have this covered well and hopefully be joined also by a diplomat. So thank you, Dolkun.
Thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I thank Observer Research Foundation for inviting this panel today. Current situation of the Uyghur is very critical and careful. All fundamental basic rights, including economic, political, religious, language rights, are threatened by the Chinese government. Today, I estimate 3 million, some media say 1 million, some is 2, some 3 million, but we definitely believe more than 3 million innocent Uyghurs are being arbitrarily detained in 21st century concentration camp by the Chinese authority. They have not been charged with any crime, provided with a lawyer or given a fair trials. They have been detained because their ethnicity, because they were born Uyghurs. They are completely innocent people. In the past 5 years in particular, we have witnessed strategy of the Chinese government shift to unapologetic assimilation and the social re-engineering of the Uyghur people. Everything that makes the Uyghur people unique, language, religion, and the culture has been targeted. Young generation of Uyghur being targeted in particularly for indoctrination. However, Chinese action poses a threat not just for the Uyghur, Tibetan, Southern Mongolian, Hong Kongers, Chinese Christian, Falun Gong activists and other groups are suffering a lot. Those days, world has witnessed on the Hong Kongs. No Hong Kong's autonomy is ours. This atrocity is not new. This problem was started since the occupation of Turkestan in 1949. Chinese government repression policy towards the Uyghur, Tibetan, Southern Mongolia has a long history. Chinese government's main purpose is completely assimilation of the Uyghur, Tibetan, and the Mongolian people. Under Xi Jinping leadership and the appointed party secretary Xinjiang, who was the party secretary in Tibet 2011-16, when he was the party secretary in Tibet, because of his repression policy, more than 150 Tibetan brothers and sisters had self-immolated. After he was appointed party secretary in Turkestan, first 10,000 of new police and military personnel had been sent to the control Uyghur population, and the dense network of police stations, roadblocks, checkpoints ensuring absolute control over the Uyghur population. We have also witnessed mass collection of the personal data from CCTV scanners, facial recognition software, public database, police checkpoint, and the DNA and blood samples. Today, as I say, over the 3 million Uyghur people are suffering and are deprived of their basic right. They are subject brainwashing amid at eroding their tie to their Uyghur identity and face torture, enforced disappearance, and death if they are not cooperated. Starting in April 2017, Chinese government cut all communication between Uyghur and the exile in diaspora. They are beginning rounded up thousands of Uyghurs sending to them the camps. Like almost all Uyghur in diaspora, I have lost contact with my family member more than 3.5 years. For over 3.5 years, I have been able to my family member. But during this time, I have got only all heartbreaking news. I received news on my mother. She had passed away. She died on May 17, 2018 in one of the concentration camps in China. Last year, 2019, I have learned another heartbreaking news. My brother, younger and older brother, are detained in the camps. This year, January 2020, I got another heartbreaking news. It was my father died. Learn all this sad news from the Chinese media or international media or some other source. I have not able to see my family in over the 26 years since I left my homeland. For this, Uyghurs who are not only concentration camps in Turkestan, life can be unbearable or their basic right are randomly denied to them, and Uyghur identity is being systematically undermined. Uyghur children are being targeted for brainwashing and indoctrination as the Chinese government attempts to erode Uyghur identity for future generations. They are not allowed to be educated their native Uyghur language, learn about the religions from their parents, or even enter the mosque. 2018, within 1 year, around 3,000 to 5,000 mosques were demolished. Some mosques have 700-800 year history, cultural heritage. Quran were collected and burned. Fasting forbidden. Even you cannot give the Islamic name to your babies. Chinese officials have described Islam as an ideological illness that must be eradicated. Uyghurs held in the camp are forced to renounce religious belief and national identity. These Uyghurs who detained in the camp outside the camp must be show the loyalty to the Chinese Communist Party and the Xi Jinping. For example, every morning before starting class, saying, "This food this water not was given by the God. Thanks for the Xi Jinping, thanks for the Chinese Communist Party. 100,000 Uyghurs are being subject to modern slavery and forced labor marketing production for the Western company. Australian Strategy Policy Institute reported recently in the March 2020, 82,000 Uyghurs sent to the Chinese province to use forced labor. But Bitterwinter reported 2019, around 400,000 Uyghur detained forced transport other provinces in China. They are possible to use chief labor, may be possible to use the organ harvesting because Chinese government advertisement 2017 halal organ harvesting. Family separation is one of the most horrible issues today. 100,000 Uyghur children separate from family. Forced marriage is also another terrible issue today. 2017-2018, Chinese government sent more than 2 million Chinese Communist Party members sent to the Uyghur family. Most of some men of this family in the concentration camp. Then so many rape was happening. And today, any young Chinese man want to marry any Uyghur woman, you don't have a right to refuse. If you refuse it, you are fundamentalist, you are religious fundamentalist or terrorist, something like that. So you don't have a choice. Recent report and Zen's clear mention on the Uyghur women forced sterilization. Actually, it's not new policy. It's not start the one-child policy for China not start in 1984, but for the Uyghur Tibetan two-child policy. But actually, after you got first child, then you got second child. It was started in 1984. Then beginning of 1990, Chinese government encouraging and sometimes falsely asking only have one child. This is the old situation is going on. It is a 21st century. So still such a atrocity was going on, but still most of the world still silent. Even today, we haven't seen any condemnation from Secretary General of the United Nations. You know, and of course we have seen some positive step. United States sanctioned Chinese official because of the Chinese official atrocity in East Turkestan for the Uyghur people. So European Parliament passed some resolution, but atrocity is continuing going on. Chinese government even 2019 and 20 also continue expanding this concentration camp. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Dolkan. There's so much there to fit into a very short time, and I know that we'll dive into some of the issues you've raised in further detail. One of the key things that's coming through in your very personal experience is these quite terrible atrocities, but the difficulty of getting access to information and knowledge about what's been going on. Your voice, of course, being one of the few able to tell those stories. But we might now go to Maya. Maya Wang is a senior researcher on China at Human Rights Watch, and in many ways the work that Maya has been doing over the past few years provides the technical and evidence-based corollary that has brought to the international community the story about what is happening within an otherwise very closed state. And I'll hand over to Maya if you wouldn't mind making your opening remarks now. And thank you so much, Dolkan. Oh, I forgot Ambassador Gautam Bambawale. It's very nice to meet you. You're very welcome. And Ambassador Bambawale is a former Indian ambassador to the People's Republic of China, also to Pakistan and Bhutan. We welcome you and the extraordinary diplomatic insight that you'll be able to bring to the discussion. For now, I'll pass over to Maya.
Thank you, Jacinda, and I'm very glad to be here today. I mean, Dolkan already gave an overview of some of the abuses that are severe and facing the Turkic Muslim population in Xinjiang, which are also connected to the suffering of Tibetans and various minorities, and of the Han people inside the country. We all have heard about the use of political education camps in Xinjiang. But I think what is happening in Xinjiang is more kind of, I guess, quote, innovative than that from an authoritarian's perspective. And let me just explain one piece of the research that we have published last year, which is concerned the use of a big data program in the region called the Integrated Joint Operations Platform. The Chinese government has also been using various mass surveillance technologies in the region. We have documented that the government collects in a mass scale people's facial images, DNA, voice samples, and even iris scans, and also gait information. And that kind of collection is not restricted, let's say, to people who are actually suspected of crimes or having committed crimes, but of ordinary people. So, for example, the collection of DNA is taken from people between the age of 12 and 65 without their consent, without they're not able to say no, and that collection of DNA could be is conducted through a physical program. So the government says, we're giving you a free physical, but in fact, it is collecting the DNA through the physical program. We know of that, Jacinda, as you have explained, through looking at various strands of evidence. So the collection of DNA, the DNA collection program, that's covert. We found a couple of official regional level documents that explain the existence of that of this collection. And the fact that these biometrics are put in a searchable database run by the police in order to discover essentially links about people and identify people, matching people to the biometric samples. So there are these various different databases that are used to identify Turkic Muslims in the region. In addition to that, so it's also not uncommon. We have also documented the use of these databases elsewhere throughout China. So the Chinese government is on a program, essentially, of mass surveillance throughout the country. But what is quite unusual about Xinjiang is the fact of how data is being integrated throughout the region. So I was going back to the Integrated Joint Operations Platform, which we published in 2019. The IJOP is a big data program that kind of ties to the many facial recognition camera systems throughout the region. It is also tied to the checkpoints throughout the region. It is connected to the mobile phone apps that are installed on government officials' cell phones. And the way it works is that the IJOP essentially keeps an eye on what's going on in the region and note any kind of irregularities concerning any individual in the region. It sounds totally dystopian, because it is. And let me explain how that works, is that if the IJOP is trained to pick up certain irregularities, and by irregularities, we're able to understand that through picking apart the policing app that is connected to the IJOP system, we're able to find out that the authorities the IJOP system would notify the police if someone uses too much electricity, if someone goes into their home through the back door instead of the front door, if someone mobile phone number has suddenly stopped being used. These are the irregularities being picked up by the IJOP system, and that kind of irregularities are being sent to the official cell phones, following which a government official would go and investigate this person, asking them why on August 31st, for example, they used too much electricity. And that app would ask the government official to go through a series of questions, including asking them on that day, why did they use too much electricity? Is it because they're a farmer? Is it because they have a new electrical appliance? Or is it because instructing the government official to take a walk through their home to see whether or not that person might have some kind of suspicious tools for cutting tools, and trusts are suspicious for terrorism. So the IJOP system, as I said, is connected to the checkpoints throughout the region. And the way it works is that the checkpoints, when you go through them, it looks like kind of airport security gates. It looks like a door you walk through, you have your facial recognition, you swipe your ID card, you have an iris scan. But unbeknown to you, your mobile phone identifying information, the IMEI number, is also being harvested and being matched against the system. So essentially, when you walk through the checkpoints, you're going through a multiple authentication biometric system that matches against the system. And if the system has some kind of problem about you, if the problem is maybe you're connected to someone who's in the political education camps, the checkpoint door would go ding, 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 ding. And we've interviewed people talking about how they feel when they're going through their daily, they're going shopping and suddenly they go through this checkpoint and it goes ding, 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 ding. And then they're taken to the police station and then they're taken to the political education camps. So since, Xinjiang has numerous checkpoints, every 500 meters in city, in every access point to the villages, the authorities are essentially setting up kind of this virtual fences throughout the region, the size of Xinjiang, that regulate people's movement depending on how threatening the authorities consider they are. And so what is happening in Xinjiang is not just about the political education camps, which is terrifying enough and abusive enough, but a series of detention facilities, from prisons to political education camps to house arrest to being restricted in their movement on their hometown or on the streets, in a series of regulatory manner, virtual and non-virtual fences that pen Turkic Muslims in, while at the same time kind of allowing some level of economic activity that takes place. No other country has access to that vast amount of real-time information. No other government in the world, in history really, has that amount of data, nor be able to have such a regulated movement mechanism in place to regulate an entire population. So I think we need to look at Xinjiang in that way, and how innovative China has been in repression, and really ask ourselves, is that the kind of future we want to see as a superpower that is growing ever more powerful? Thank you.
Well, thank you, Maya. Extraordinary stuff. And I might just note the report that you're referring to, the groundbreaking report you published last year, is available on the Human Rights Watch website. And for those who are watching, it has a lot of useful references and visuals to explain the data and the way things work that Maya was going through. Extraordinary stuff. Now, Rafael Pantucci, we're delighted to have on the panel because Raf is a terrorism expert, counter-terrorism expert, but has also studied for many years China's relations with Western governments in particular, and has done so from the perspective of think tanks around the world, including in China. Now, Raf, as you're listening to this, what would be fabulous for everyone is to step back and take a bird's eye view. We've had the very personal story, case studies of the Uyghurs, as told beautifully by Dolkan, Maya talking about this extraordinary impact of a surveillance state. Where does this fit in this interesting interplay between calling your citizens terrorists and the way that China is relating with the rest of the world in these challenging times?
Well, thank you, Jacinta, and thank you, ORF, for the kind invitation. It's a shame we can't do this in Delhi, but I'm delighted that we can do this at least in this online format. And it was excellent to hear Dolkan and Maya's, very emotional and very well-researched work. So thank you for the invitation to join you. So as you say, I'll try to step back a little bit and put it in a sort of bigger context. Very aware that this is, of course, a very emotional issue that's very personal to a lot of people that we're actually talking about. I think from Beijing's perspective, the issue that they're looking at is one that they see through the lens of counterterrorism and countering violent extremism. And this is very much the language that they use. And in some ways, this helps explain what they're doing. Now, there is a dispute about this in the sort of academic space, about the degree to which one can say this is fair or not. But I think this is, from my interactions with Chinese officials and experts, they do talk about it within this sort of counterterrorism frame. And from their perspective, they're dealing with a problem that needs, as they have said, eradication and ripping out from its root. And so in many ways, what we're seeing in the very extreme policies that have been deployed is an attempt to do that. It's a real attempt to try to dig in to the deepest parts of the Uyghur community and those who live in Xinjiang to try to see if they can change their perspectives so that they no longer want to even vaguely think about being drawn towards the ideas that might express themselves as terrorism or violent extremism. So that's the kind of frame that they're looking at it, and they're just taking it to this sort of very extreme approach and model to actually try to deliver that. And by putting it in this frame, however, it does have an effect of complicating trying to mobilize an international response. And it does that for a number of reasons. For one reason, it does it in some ways because there are some Uyghurs who are involved in jihadist networks around the world. We have seen some evidence of militancy from some of these groups. It is certainly by no stretch of imagination the majority. It's a minority within a minority, but there are some within. And this causes a sort of complication because on the one hand, governments will say, well, you know, we don't particularly like what's happening within China and we don't think this is the approach to deal with it, but there is a problem that we do need to try to find a way to look at. And in a way, a sort of another example you could look at internationally that is similar in some ways is what we've seen happen in Chechnya and with Russia, where there is a very similar sort of issue where you have clearly there is a sense that the Russian government's response is not dealing with the problem, potentially actually even making it worse, but at the same time there is a problem. And so how do you kind of strike that balance? Now then when we look around the Muslim world, I would argue that there's an additional problem, which is in a lot of these countries, not all, but in a lot of the sort of prominent countries in the Muslim world, they do take quite a draconian response themselves to dealing with some of their own problems at home. And so this means that when they look at what China's doing and they look at what they're doing at home, they say, well, I'd rather not point fingers because someone might start pointing fingers at me. And so there's fear that, you know, you don't want to start throwing rocks around if you're living in glass houses. And then I think on top of this, you have the additional issue that China has, you know, gone from being a power that was, you know, a sort of developing country that was rising to being the world's big coming power, this world's second largest economy. And I think that's important not only from the perspective that I think we often get caught up in, is you say, well, it's this giant money pot that everyone kind of wants access to, but it's really more about the fact that this is the coming power and no one quite knows where it's going to end up on the international stage and therefore where it is, how it is you want to shape your relationship with them. And so I think that complicates a lot of countries who look at this and say, well, you know, China maybe did something they were a bit concerned about, but how are we going to counter that and how are we going to deal with that? And they might not necessarily think that the confrontational approach that's being advanced at the moment, in particular by Washington, and we're seeing coming out of a lot of other Western countries as well, is necessarily the answer to that. So when we add that up with the fact that they worry about, you know, this is the world's second largest power, and the fact that this second largest power has been advancing this policy of non-interference for a very long time, I think there is a sort of cumulative set of issues there that does help to some degree explain why it is some of these countries have not been more vocal about their sort of anger towards what's happening within China or how China is treating its own minority communities. The final point I'd add here, aware that time is pressing on, is I would add a sort of a bigger contextual thing to think about. Is what we are asking to happen here is for China to change its treatment and its behavior of its own people. So for China to change a fundamental policy within. Now, I'm not saying that, you know, I'm not justifying the policy or anything like that, but I am saying we have to think a little bit about how difficult that is for a country to do. And especially for a country to do that in response to external pressure. You know, that would be a pretty large admission of weakness in some ways. Now, again, I'm not saying that this pressure shouldn't be kept up. But I am saying that it is a very difficult thing that we're expecting to happen from Beijing. And it does mean that when we're trying to deal with it, it does mean we really have to think about how we're actually going to effectively do it. And the final point I would add is that I think one of the slightly complicating factors at the moment is that China is in the middle of this great clash with the United States that is slowly bringing everyone else into it and creating this sort of bigger Cold War context. And the problem, I think, is that that means that a whole lot of issues end up getting jumbled together into one. And some of these issues are very mercenary trade issues, and some of them are really deep, problematic human rights issues. And the difficulty is that when these all get blended together, there's a tendency to see, well, maybe one can be traded off the other. When in reality, we should be single-mindedly focusing on the human rights issues because these are problems that we really do need to find ways of addressing and changing. But the difficulty is that when they all get wrapped up in everything else, it becomes very difficult to actually get China to sort of move on some of these complicating issues. So I'll leave it at that and I guess pass on back to Jacinta, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you. Well, that was extraordinary. We promised expertise and passion and complexity, and I think all speakers so far have certainly given that. A quick note before I go to Gautam to ask for your insights is just to remind those who are watching online that if you would like to put a question forward for the Q&A coming in a few minutes, you can use the chat function at the bottom of your window. So please do that. We've got some questions coming in, and keep them coming. Ambassador Bambawale, it's an absolute pleasure and delight to have you here. I think there's a beautiful flow on now from breaking out that international perspective. We would love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jacinta. And let me say what a pleasure it is to be with all of you this afternoon. Definitely, I think the star of our particular panel is, of course, Mr. Dolkun Isa. And I paid very close attention to what he said and what the other panelists said. I'm going to be brief, but I'm going to try to stitch all this together. And the point that I'm making is that ever since, if you look as far back as 1949 and the establishment of the People's Republic of China, you will see that one of the threads which runs through this period since 1st October 1949 is the aggressiveness of the Chinese Communist Party, first domestically, internally within China, and now more recently over the past 10 years or so, as it has grown in its economic power, as it has grown in hard power. Increasingly, you're seeing this aggressiveness externally towards other countries. And I think you in Australia are definitely at the receiving end of such aggressiveness in the recent past, as we are here in India. So let me just bring to the attention of all of the listeners and the viewers that it was as far back as 1950 when the PLA marched into Tibet and took over control of Tibet that you began to see the policies which are now increasingly being seen not only in Xinjiang, but also in other parts of China. So there is this aggressiveness to its own people, especially if those people are slightly different and in one way or the other. So there is very little space for difference of opinion. There is very little space for differences in background, religion, language, etc. in the People's Republic of China. And you can see that in Xinjiang. I don't want to go into the details. I have experienced on the streets of Xinjiang some of the things that both Dolkun and Maya spoke about. It's an unimaginable level of hostility. The number of stops that you have to make at every street corner where you need to identify yourself, pull out your papers is absolutely frightening. It's a complete police state as far as I can see, and that I talk about Xinjiang. But you can also see this aggressiveness towards some of the Han people itself. And let me give you all an example. The recent use of social credit scores and the decision by the leadership of the Communist Party of China to use this increasingly as time goes by is something which needs to be studied and needs to be kept abreast of. So I think the point I'm trying to make is that ever since 1949, ever since His Holiness the Dalai Lama ran away from Tibet and was given asylum here in India, and he's still here with us in 1959, that was. You can see that there is this streak of aggressiveness in the governance mechanisms and in the governance structures of the Communist Party of China, which today, now over the past 10 years, are increasingly being seen at an international level. So whether you look at what China has been doing in the South China Seas, or what it has been doing in the Taiwan Straits, or what it has been doing in the Senkaku Islands, which Japan claims as its own, and now you can see that on the India-China border. So you see this streak of aggressiveness, which was traditionally used internally and domestically, now increasingly as China becomes a more powerful country, both in terms of hard power, in terms of soft power being used internationally. And I think this is something that all of us need to follow. This is something that all of us need to focus on, because this is the kind of nation that we're dealing with, not just domestically in Xinjiang and in Tibet, but also internationally. So I'll make this broad point, Jacinta, and I'll stop there, because I think I see a continuum, a continuity in the behavior of the Chinese Communist Party, both domestically and now increasingly internationally. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. That was a wonderful insight, and I think it rounded out in as neat a way as we can a very complex discussion. I will take the chair's privilege of just asking a couple of quick questions before we open to the questions that are coming through on chat. And I will pose the first one to Dolkun, because in this full circle from the very personal, extraordinary story that Dolkun told, personal for a people, we were talking very much about identity, ethnicity, freedom of religion, freedom of speech. But as we went through the other speakers, right through to Raf and Gautam, we were talking about ideology and coming back to a sense of communist ideology, a Han way of doing things and language, and also Raf talking about different definitions about the way the world works, and these things coming through as justification. This conference is about ideology. Typically we talk about terrorist ideology, but Dolkun, can you expand on what you see as a democracy and freedom versus this authoritarian move in a communist guise? I think you don't have your volume on, Dolkun.
Sorry, yeah.
Thank you.
Well, as we know, Chinese Communist Party is a communistic ideology. It is repression. Since the 70s, more than 71 years, we have seen just repression. And another point, CCP cannot accept diversity. Some other country, some other nationalities staying together, they cannot accept this. Just today is what's going on for the instruction for the Uyghur people in the Tibet and southern Mongolia, saying you are being Chinese or you will be died. That's why forcefully to renounce national identity, religious identity. So Chinese government and CCP, the communist ideology, just bring suffering to the people, and bring just tortures, psychological torture, physical tortures. This is the main problem today. Unfortunately, still most of some country still couldn't understand this, particularly Muslim world. China's government today, and also Chinese CCP, is the main purpose is anti-religious policy. Not only persecuted the Uyghur Muslim today, Chinese Christian, Tibetan Buddhist, Falun Gong, all religions are suffering today, religious people. But I already told Chinese government saying Islam is ideological illness. It must be eradicated. It does mean Chinese government already start war against Islam. But unfortunately, most of them Islamic country silent for this atrocity, not only silent, some of them already support the Chinese policy today. Yeah.
Thank you, Dolkun. And I might just expand this out to other panelists, but also just pick up on this idea of countries not calling out behaviours. It's very high profile that Muslim countries in particular, some who have come out very strongly to condemn cartoons in Denmark, other things that might be seen as humorous, but anything that is seen as a slight against Islam has been taken quite seriously by certain more conservative Muslim countries. Yet we do see that many are silent on the issue of Uyghurs. Are we seeing with Muslim countries, and perhaps with others as well, that there's a split between ideology and a functional relationship. Raf talked about the economic engagement and power. Maya talked about this as well. I might just open up and bring Raf in first, and perhaps Maya and Gautam to comment on these issues.
I mean, I think that you know, you sort of put your finger on the button when you make the point of how much noise is made about cartoons in Denmark and how silence there is about what's happening here. So I think it does speak to a hypocrisy, unfortunately, that we do see. And unfortunately, it's a hypocrisy that we see repeatedly. I mean, as I said in my comments, I think it is a lot to do with power. I think the economic relationship sometimes is a significant element of it, but I do think it's more than that. And I think if we just focus on the economic side, we kind of miss the bigger point, which is, you know, China as a power has for a long time been selling itself as the kind of leader of the other. You know, before the sort of Hu Jintao era, you still had quite a meek China on the world stage. There was still, even in the Hu Jintao era, you had this sort of notion of, you know, hiding and biding your time. It was very much, you know, stay in the background, you know, don't make yourself forward. And, you know, China was relatively, what could I say, modest player on the international stage, to the frustration of a great deal, actually, of a great many. But I think now what we've seen is that has changed. But I think having that period beforehand, means that China's history with a lot of this world is history that is kind of being written now in some ways. And so the relationships that they're building are ones that are built from now. And so in a way, these are ones that are starting from a perspective of, this is now the big important power. How is our relationship with this power going to be? And do we really want to start it in this very contentious way, when ultimately the goal that they're trying to achieve is one that a lot of these countries are quite worried someone might try to turn on them. You know, if we think, for example, about a country like Saudi Arabia, you know, the sort of purported leader of the Muslim world, the land that has the holy sites on it, you know, they've been doing they've been persecuting some of their minorities in pretty awful ways as well. And this doesn't get any airplay, but it doesn't get any attention from China. And so for a country like Saudi Arabia, they don't really want to raise these issues up, because if they do in another country, then they worry that that country might do it to them. And so that does give this kind of protective bubble in some ways around what is happening, around condemnation towards what's happening from parts of the Muslim world.
Thank you. Maya?
I would share a story I had. So I have been campaigning on, you know, rights issues in China for over 10 years. And of course, governments always have about 5 excuses at least to tell you why that we're not going to speak up about human rights in China. So it's not uncommon, even for Western countries, to say, well, we have all these other relationships we have to take care of. But I have been quite struck by the silence of the Muslim majority countries. I was in Indonesia talking about Xinjiang to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs there. So one of the main people that I spoke with spoke fluent Chinese, and it appeared that the person has studied in China before becoming a government official in Indonesia. And then that's nothing wrong with people studying in China, obviously. And then I went downstairs after this meeting, and because of the way I look, some other person came up to me and said, "Hey, I'm studying in whatever Chinese city, and I'm learning Chinese. I'm on a Chinese government scholarship." So it appears to me that in Indonesia, and many kind of in the rising political stars in various Islamic movements, Islamic groups, among the press, journalists are being invited, given scholarships to study Chinese and Chinese culture and language and politics in China, supported by the Chinese government. So now everybody can have different experiences inside China. But this kind of training programs, these kind of free scholarships, does promote a certain way of seeing the Chinese government and China. That also feed back into a certain perspective that denies atrocities in Xinjiang. And I think we need to think about, influence in a much broader, and national security in a broader manner to encompass the promotion of human rights and freedom of thought. For so long, I think the Chinese government has a fairly strong hold on, for example, the media, in many kind of non-Western countries, and it is also we also basically don't have much independent scholarship on China. That is increasingly we have think tanks, academics, students, journalists that were supported by some form of Chinese government funding that promotes a certain view. So independent scholarship, efforts to protect academic freedom, students from China on campuses outside of China to be able to speak their thoughts without fear are some of those things that we think should be happening. Another thought I have was also that when I spoke with Indonesian government official, a very common narrative, I think Raf also mentioned that, was that now we are in a US-China competition. We can't offend either side. So we're not going to speak about Xinjiang because it would seem to be aligned with the US. And because China has for a long time been posing as a champion for non-Western states. So I think in addition to kind of economic power, I think a lot of these governments really do still think ideologically we don't really have anything in opposition to what the Chinese government is doing. It's just another way of doing things rather than really standing up and say, wait a minute, this is really wrong. I think for a variety of reasons, both for these reasons, I think these governments have been quite silent. And it's not just about economics, although it plays a large part of it.
We might just have to stop there, Maya, and there are so many questions coming in. Thank you very much, everyone. I might, Ambassador Bambawale, if you don't mind, just pose one of these questions to you. Sure. We've got a question here about relations with Central Asian nations and OIC in relation to the Uyghur situation, and a good question of, well, what do we do about that? How is China engaging with these countries to influence them? Is there a way for the rest of the community to deal with those countries?
That's an excellent question, but I think it is absolutely essential to take up these issues, especially right now, the problems that the Uyghurs are facing in Xinjiang, at international fora. So I do hope that increasingly there will be countries and nation states and governments which would raise these issues and this particular issue in international fora. And I do hope that the Central Asians would also, and other countries who are Islamic and part of the OIC would also support and raise these issues in international fora. I completely agree with all the previous speakers that this is very essential, this is necessary. I do hope that it happens. Thank you.
Dolkan, did you want to add anything to that, specifically in relation to Central Asian countries and China's engagement? You're on mute. If you can turn.
Sorry. Yeah. One thing I would like to emphasize today is China's why so repression to the Uyghurs and also expansionist policy to Central Asia, some other country. One Belt, One Road, both Belt Road projects or new secret project of China is actually territorial expanded project. Today, 21st century. Not like 18th century, 20th century, you use the arm to occupy some other country. Not it's possible, but China used to. It is economic than trying to occupy Central Asia country, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan. We have seen a lot of evidence on this. Chinese government is actually this Belt Road project not benefit at all. No, slowly, some country understands this. Chinese government give loan to Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, this country, but they are very corrupted government. They cannot back this money to China. Then China says, doesn't matter. You don't pay the money, you can give is your territory. You give the land, So now it is that this country faces a problem. That's why all the country cannot speak loudly for the Uyghur issue. All the country know very well what's going on in China. But most of some countries depend on the Chinese money. It's some countries too late. So that's why we are warning around the world. It is a time whole the world should not be silenced. Because Belt on the Road is Uzbekistan, is the Uyghur region is the center of the Belt on the Road initiative. from Kashgar to Guarda. This is 3,800 kilometers away. Another from Urumqi to Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan to Europe. So this is very dangerous. Not Chinese government use this one belt, one road, not only economical occupies this country, also imposes communistic, Marxistic ideology to this all. We have seen Confucius Institute established around the world. China spends so much money and they impose ideological communistic ideology as well. So that's why. That's why. So it is a time. Not only we are talking, not only for the sake of Uyghur life. This today, if we hold the word silence, we can see it is after 20 years later. China being is more number one economic around the world. What kind of world we have to live? Global democracy, global human rights now threatened by the Chinese Communist Party now.
So moving on probably up to a bigger community in the world, we have a question here. Having heard that China's been following this aggressive policy, initially domestically and now externally, is it possible for the world's democracies to come together to check aggressive behaviours? Raf, do you have any perspective on this? Democracy has come up, countering corruption has come up as an issue.
I think, I'm often not sure how helpful it is to frame things in the context of democracies versus autocracies. Because, again, this is a very complicated issue. And actually, how countries really see themselves and are isn't always necessarily how others would interpret them. So I think to frame it in that sort of light of democracies versus autocracies doesn't always work. In part also because there are problems within democratic countries as well, and there are things that we get wrong as well. And so I think there's always a danger in framing it in that sort of a way. I think in terms of trying to check Chinese aggression going out, I think at the moment we are in a very difficult situation where China has, I think, been, it's quite interesting in a way because there was a discussion back in like the mid-2000s leaking into the early 2010s about China needing to be a more responsible stakeholder on the world stage. And there was a sense that China was kind of this passive actor which is slowly becoming this giant and slowly becoming really significant, but not actually living up to any of its goals and any of its sort of responsibilities as the world's second largest economy. And so there's a big push for China to try to do that. And unfortunately, I think what we're seeing to some degree is through Xi Jinping in particular is the kind of net result in some ways of that happening, where you've got this power which now says, I've gone in 30 years from being a backwater to being a first world country, by which I mean if you go to Shanghai and you see the sort of development that's there and you see the prosperity and you see how, Chinese people are living a better life today than they did, 20 years ago. So they've had this sort of transformation and they say this transformation's worked quite well. And this has created a great sense of achievement in many ways at home. And I think this is a lot of what's stirring the kind of aggression and a lot of the kind of very pushy China that we're now seeing on the world stage. And I think that is, frankly, a very difficult issue to try to manage. And I think when we're looking at a lot of the border confrontations that are happening at the moment where China's poking out, part of the problem is that a lot of these, for China's perspective, these domestic issues. Even the dispute with India, this is disputed borderlands that they're talking about, where the Chinese say, well, actually it's ours, and the Indians say, well, actually it's ours. And there is no sort of clear line. And that means what they're fighting for and what they're pushing is really part of their nation itself. And so that great sense of sort of strength, that sense of rejuvenation, that sense of we've kind of reached our place on the world stage, and so now we can really push ourselves and assert ourselves, is really what's, I think, driving this very sort of aggressive, and I saw one of the questions referred to this sort of wolf warrior diplomacy. I think that's really what's driving all this, is the great sense of confidence on the world stage. I think the real danger is that what tends to follow confidence is hubris. And I think that's what we're seeing to some degree at the moment, where I think China is really pushing out. And in a lot of cases, we've seen in the past few months that China's picking fights with some of its neighbors that are entirely unnecessary. For example, the border clash with India. I know Indian colleagues might disagree with me here, but ultimately the China-India relationship, I think, was one that President Modi would like to have on an even keel, and that he would like the two powers to kind of rise in a sort of similar way and to become strong sort of Asian giants together. And so in many ways, the sort of natural inclination for Delhi is to try to find a way of cooperating with Beijing. But because of this border spat, it's now very difficult to do that. We've seen similar spats breaking out with Kazakhstan, with Tajikistan recently, and with Russia, all powers that are naturally inclined to work with China on the world stage. And I think that's what we're seeing is an element of this hubris sort of creeping in. And I think that is kind of one of the most difficult elements, I think, at the moment that we're seeing in terms of how to try to check China's aggression on the world stage. Thank you.
I'd just like to chip in. I'd just like to chip in and continue the thought that Raf was just mentioning. If you can give me a couple of minutes, Jacinta, I won't take more of time than that. But I think, yeah. So at this moment in time, especially in a world which is a large part of the world is still dealing with the pandemic or is still dealing with the last bits of the pandemic, the COVID-19 and the coronavirus crisis. But at this point in time, I think the image of China across the world is at its lowest in several decades. And therefore, China's soft power is probably at its lowest in many, many decades. And therefore, I think this is the time for a pushback on several issues. I won't go into each of those issues separately, but definitely the one on which our panel is centered on. And I think this is doable, this is possible. And I hope that it happens. I agree with Raf that most governments are reluctant to do it. But I do hope that at this point in time, when China's image, when China's soft power across the world is at its weakest in decades, that these issues can be brought onto the discussion table. So I'll stop there, Jacinta. Thank you.
No, very wonderful intervention. Thank you, Ambassador. And it really strikes me as living in a country where we have a significant Chinese Australian population that's an extraordinary part of our community, very vibrant part of our community. And of course, Australia has benefited significantly from trade with China. In our region, the soft power of the government of China, the people of China, the economy of China does still have a lot of credits in it. And as I try and draw this extraordinary discussion to a conclusion, I might just bring us back. There's a great question here about how China is managing this balancing act with a myriad of international issues, and I would add domestic issues, as Raf has highlighted. Is the pandemic just forcing China perhaps to have too much pressure on it, potentially leading to strategic miscalculation? That's a question. You can answer that or say something else that you'd like as we sum up. I'll go first to Raf, and then we'll go around with some final comments before we finish up.
I think in terms of the pandemic and the pressure it's putting on China, I actually wonder a little bit about this. I think in the early days, Beijing did feel a lot of pressure because of the pandemic and the problems it was causing at home. I actually think now the fact that they've got it under control, the fact that if you go to Shanghai, Beijing, people aren't even wearing face masks. Life seems to have returned to kind of normal. Whereas they just look at the news and see what's happening in the United States and Europe. I think they think that actually they've handled it fairly well. And so I'm not so sure that actually they feel that international pressure so much anymore. I think the story from their perspective is one of success at home. In fact, success in contrast to what's happening in other places. So I think they would actually at this point scratch it up as a victory. And I think they've pointed, the fingers of where even the virus has emanated from. They managed to create enough sort of confusion around that at the moment that, there is some dispute, which I think is sort of absurd. So I'm actually not so sure that the virus has ended up putting that much pressure that we think on Beijing. I think the bigger contextual confrontation that we're seeing with China happening at the moment, led in particular by the United States, is the thing that's really causing the sort of trouble and difficulties on the international stage for Beijing. Thank you.
The power of uncertainty. Thank you. Maya, closing comments?
Yeah, I think there's some kind of narrative, particularly in the West, that somehow China is failing or is somehow being pressured, is acting out or whatever, or its demographics is going to set it back and so on. I think this is all just really wishful thinking. For years, we think that oh, maybe China rising, they're going to be more like us. Now the narrative is they're failing, so they're going to not pose such a threat. We're going to be okay. All of this just really give an excuse to say for us to dug our heads in the sand and not really come out with a China strategy. I fear that a lot of governments right now are dealing with China in a piecemeal manner. When Xinjiang blows up, what are we going to do with Xinjiang? When Hong Kong blows up, what are we going to do with Hong Kong? But we don't have a unified strategy on China using protection of human rights as the basis of a foundation of foreign policy. So I hope we will see that in the future.
Thank you, Maya. And we might just say it actually covers off well a question about what will happen in the future in terms of not only Xinjiang, but Tibet and potentially Hong Kong and the focus on human rights. Dolkun, any final comments?
Yeah, I already told also is so many atrocity was happening in the East Turkestan, Tibet. Now it's coming Hong Kong, and the Chinese government CCP testing all step by step. And one of the slogans of the Hong Kong's demonstrator saying is, "We are not being second Xinjiang." Starts demonstration last year. Now is the autonomy over the Hong Kong. Chinese government never keeps its promise. Chinese government, even during the pandemic time, not really fighting against the pandemic and the COVID-19, but Chinese government CCP fighting against the truth, hiding the reality. Blocks the information, not cooperating internationally. That's why we see in result so many death cases. If Chinese government kindly to cooperate internationally, then maybe less people die than no. So that's why most world should be understand what is the aim or what is the character of the CCP, because the lie hiding the reality is the character of the Chinese Communist Party. But still, quite a lot of countries continue believing the Chinese liar, but it should be whole the world take some lesson from our experience, from the Hong Kong's experience, from the Tibetan experience.
Thank you very much for that. Ambassador Gautam, we might just have to close up very quickly, if you've just got a brief comment.
Yeah, I'm going to be brief and quick. And over the past few decades, there have been three big questions about China. The first is whether it would be a peaceful rise. I think the answer to that today is very clear. It is not going to be a peaceful rise of China. The second big question was whether China is a responsible stakeholder in the international system. I think the answer to that is very clear also. She is not a responsible stakeholder in the international system. And the third and final question is that about the Chinese dream. And I believe that the Chinese dream is going to be a nightmare for many other societies, many other peoples, and many other nation states. I'll end there.
Thank you very much. Well, we've had a tour de force. On behalf of everyone watching the webinar, I would like to thank our speakers, Dolkun Issa, Raffaello Pantucci, Maya Wang, and Ambassador Gautam Bambawale.